So you've talked a bit about God's love. In the introductions you did for us, you talked about God's love being one of the themes we're going to be looking at. And as Christians, we talk about God loves us.
Mm.
How do you know that God loves you, David?
Well, I think we talk about God being the creator.
Yeah.
So we often think that's the Big Bang evolution. into that view of what creation's about. That might be a controversial thing to say. I don't know. But we think it's a past event. But actually it's not a past event. We're only held in being. You're only here today because of God's love. Creation is a continuous present act.
Mm.
So the fact I'm here and you're here is a sign of God's love.
Mm.
We also gaze around the world at all the gifts God's given us. But supremely for Christians, it's about Jesus. So the incarnation, the Son of God becoming a human being, and his life being motivated, and everything he does exemplifies love. And that reaches its kind of most vivid zenith. The highest point of love is the cross, when Jesus is lifted up and crucified for us. Mm. So I look at the world around us, but supremely I look at Jesus.
And you've talked a bit about God expressing God's love through creation, through our presence.
Yes.
Can you say something more about how God expresses God's love for us as created people, I guess? We're created by God.
Well, I think we experience it through human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So if I was to look back at my own life, I learned about love from my parents and my sister, my family. I reference them in the introduction to the book.
Yes.
You know, I learned to live for love in that context.
You've got that great quote from your dad.
I have.
From when you were a teenager, him
Yes.
saying, "This is all about love," and you think, yeah, right.
Just,
you agree with him finally.
Yeah, I asked him what the Christian faith was about. He said it's all about love, and I said I just felt it's too simple to try and answer. But then looking back at it, my dad was a very wise person, and I think he's actually spot on. So yeah, I think we experience it throughout. You know, I look back at my life, and there's people I can say I learned about love from you, I experienced love from you. So I suppose for most of us, that's where we experience God's love on a regular, routine basis. In the everyday, what do people do for us? Yeah.
People's experience of love is really interesting, isn't it? And we all have conflicting experiences
We do.
of love. I'm just thinking about that story in the Bible of the prodigal son.
Yes.
And the young man's friends all disappear when he has no money left. And I guess most of us have got experience of what might be called fake friends.
Yes.
So how do we know when love is such a precious thing?
It is.
And we become very vulnerable when we love. How do you know when there's real love going on and when it's just, paper thin and is going to disappear at a moment's notice, or can't you know that?
I think there are certain tests. I think we can recognise when love is fake. So I think when it's not sustained, so when the friends disappear when life gets tough for him, so there's not faithfulness and commitment there. I think one of the things we do know about love is it doesn't involve control. So some abusive relationships can be controlling. So there's got to be a freedom in love, freedom to flourish, to be yourself. And there has to be some level of emotional investment. So I think if people kind of, when we're sad, kind of resonate with that, and when we're joyful, they resonate with that, then there's some sense of them being involved in our lives, emotionally invested in our lives. And I think that's one of the other key signs. But I think the real test of love comes back to the cross again, because it's about sacrifice and cost. So I think we see that. I'm always impressed by people who've got this kind of display their love with a deep kind of sacrificial commitment. So somebody, for example, who visits an elderly relative in a nursing home week after week after week, that kind of solid, dependable, faithful, reliable, committed love. We see the authenticity of that because of the cost to the person. So that's the acid test, I think.
What does it cost you?
What does it cost you? And we say that about marriage, don't we, sometimes as a joke. What's the most expensive thing about a wedding?
Yeah.
And the answer is the vows, because we don't know what they're going to cost us.
Yeah.
And of course it's in there in the wedding vows, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health.
Yes.
So it's that faithful commitment, whatever the cost.
And of course you can't buy that.
You can't buy that.
Yeah.
But it's the most precious thing.
It is the most precious thing. So, who's God's love for?
And for me, the kind of supreme biblical story that illustrates that is the prodigal son story. So there's a lovely small verse in the midst of that story, which I'm sure you know. The people listening have got some grasp of it. But the son goes off to a distant land, the younger son goes off to a distant land. In the act of that, he humiliates his father, rejects his father's love, goes to a distant land, spends his money on wine, women, and dancing, whatever goes on, that kind of lifestyle. Runs out of money, his friends disappear because he's run out of money, he falls on hard times, ends up on a pig farm, he's about to eat the pig swell, which for the Jewish audience would have been a real low point, because pigs are unclean animals. Yes. Then he begins the journey back. We can imagine smelly, unkempt, bedraggled. And then there's this verse, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. So you get this idea the father's been looking at every day for him. Is it today? Is it today? And then when he sees him, he goes running out to meet him. So that kind of passion, the seeking and searching, the going out to meet, the embracing, is how God feels about each one of us. But the challenge is he feels that way about everybody in this room and anybody we know. So our challenge is to embrace that universality of love, to recognise that God loves everyone, and we too are called to embrace that kind of love. But it's a story set against Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees, which I think is a really interesting thing to look at, because Jesus says the first thing you do is you love people, and then they respond to that love, rather than seeking for people to be good before you love them. The Pharisees were known for kind of excluding people who were difficult, shunned the sinner, the prostitute, the tax collector, the outsiders. Jesus embraced them, and through his embrace of them they began to change. Now in the story you have the son returning and being embraced, and a celebration. So here you have the joy, which I mentioned earlier, the joy of discovering that love, and that love can include that rejection, make it part of the narrative, embrace the past, accept the past, but give a new start and celebrate the new start. And then you have the older son who's carping from a distance, saying this love is too much. So there's something about family, about embracing people, about being in community, and the person watching that love unfold, not carping but rejoicing about it. So when new people come into church and we feel a bit dislodged, or things begin to shift, don't carp, celebrate the fact there's new people here. And what does that mean for us as a community? How do we need to shift and change to integrate them? How do we become different because we've got new people in our midst?
So, do you have to love God for God to love you?
No.
So he just loves us?
It's just a given. There's nothing you can do to make God love you more, nothing you can do to make God love you less. God's love is just a rock solid thing for us.
And for all
and for all people.
Each person
everybody,
created.
Yeah. It's got no favourites, we're all exactly the same in terms of his love.
Which is another, seriously, a wow just is such an inadequate
no.
word, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact we're here bears witness to that,
Yeah.
This person's in front of me, they must be loved by God because God's holding them in being.
Yeah.
Brought them into my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I draw a picture, I think, in there of heaven and hell. Which is just a picture, so don't get too ask too many questions about the picture. But the picture is of a sumptuous meal in the middle, so a table full of delicious, scrummy food. And in heaven, and in both places you're given an implement that doesn't allow you to feed yourself because it's too long. You can't get the food into your own mouth. You must feed the people opposite. In heaven that happens. There's a nice buzz, everybody's fed. There's a good atmosphere. In hell, everybody's trying to feed themselves, and everybody starves. So the vision is of everybody living in mutual love, but it starts with you and me taking that risk of loving regardless.
So if we're people who don't know God's love, how do we get ourselves into that? If people are hearing this conversation think, that sounds so cool. How do people get to experience God's love?
Well, I would say two things. I'd say one, look at Jesus. So read the Gospels. Read Mark, for example. Mark's probably easiest. It's a racy gospel. Everything happens at a super fast pace. Immediately this happens, then something else immediately happens. It's one thing after another, helter-skelter, and until you get to about chapter 10 where it shifts. And you get into the long narrative leading to the crucifixion. The things are happening to Jesus rather than Jesus being proactive and the protagonist. So read that gospel because it's shot through with stories about Jesus and about you see love in action. It's preeming the cross. So look at the Gospels, look at Jesus. The second thing I would urge you to do is get involved in a church. Now, churches are not perfect communities of love, but they are on a journey, hopefully, and they're seeking to love. So you should be with others people who are seeking to love and seeking to learn about what love means.